So when conservatives talk about technology, at least the conservatives that I've spent a lot of time with, obviously there's a subset of them that, as the kind of the tech guys have moved, tech bros have moved to the right. There is some optimism and excitement around, David Sachs, Peter Thiel, those guys. But the more religious the group that I'm with, the more doomer we get as soon as we start talking about biotech, AI, and it gets pretty dark pretty quickly. So part of what I wanted to do today is actually kind of make the case for techno-optimism, but looking at it through the lens of a Judeo-Christian framework. But then also hold that up, and we can poke some holes in it. We can discuss it. We can debate it and see where it goes. But Frank, you're the resident entrepreneur here, business guy. So I'm wondering, as you look at things from the perspective of an entrepreneur and a serious Catholic, what gives you, if you were to kind of steelman that case for techno-optimism, what gives you kind of hope in terms of where technology is headed and its possibilities for American life?
So if we think of, some of this depends on how narrowly we define technology. I don't know that it necessarily requires a machine, right? A new process. If we could discover cold fusion, right? That innovation, that ability to pull together resources, figure out a better way to do something. In that regard, I have tremendous optimism because we're talking about human ingenuity applied to the natural world, and then it's funny, as I was flying in, I saw this clover leaf that I flew over, and I thought, in Atlanta, we're not building as many clover leaves. They've sort of engineered the clover leaf when you're at an interchange, and you go around. And I'm not seeing as many because I think there's been more studies of how that starts to clog up the highway. So we're thinking of a new way of creating. Is that technology? I would argue, yeah, kind of. I mean, you're going to use materials in a more productive way to keep all the traffic moving. My wife wonders why every time we go someplace, even if we've been 50 times, I'm trying to figure a better way. And I almost can't help myself. I'm timing it, and I'm trying to figure out what's the best way to get there. This idea of tinkering and innovating. And so I think sometimes we think technology is this flash that happens and something totally new was created where there was nothing in between, when usually it's really incremental. It's just this constant incremental tinkering by people who have an itch to make things a little faster, a little quicker, taste a little better, and in that regard, we're talking about, in my opinion, how optimistic are you about human innovation? Wonderfully so. Now, can human beings get themselves in a mess when they tinker with things too much? And so I think, interesting enough, with Mark Andreessen, there's it almost seems maybe a little bit ideological that somehow technology in and of itself. But I think to not be optimistic about human ingenuity, which technology seems to me just the result of, I don't know why someone would not be, by and large, have an optimistic bias toward that.
Yeah. Now, Ross, when you wrote The Decadent Society, it sort of began and ended with the Apollo moon landing. Recently, the vice president mentioned that anecdote in one of his speeches that he gave at Claremont as kind of a moment that he was hearkening back to channel something for the future. When you were, at least I'm curious, over 5 years ago when you were writing that, or 6 years ago, what was it that you were hoping this future could look like? And has your position changed 5 years later now that we've seen kind of AI take off? And since you had that,
when I was very young and on the right, I think my views were really close to a lot of the religious conservatives who were just, you're talking about being in conversation with, where sort of technological modernity seemed to be in some kind of deep tension with religious faith and traditional modes of life. And the job of the conservative or the Christian was just to sort of try and restrain this Promethean engine from devouring our humanity, right? That's probably what I would have said at age 20, maybe. in a time machine that we haven't invented yet. At age 40, I felt more like the world that I was living in, its biggest problem was stuckness and stagnation. And one of my basic views about the history of the Western world, history of Christian civilization, is that there really actually isn't some moment of kind of pastoralist stability that you can look back to, right? Like basically as soon as Western Europe got up off its back after the Dark Ages and the barbarian invasions, they started innovating. Like if you look at trends in technological innovation, they start in the 11th and 12th century and just sort of go upward from there. And, whether that's divine providence or a satanic deception, I'm not completely competent to adjudicate, but it is the civilization we've had, not for 50 years, but for 800 years, right? And it doesn't seem like there's a way out of that into some alternative mode that doesn't involve some kind of collapse that I would prefer not to live through. So I've ended up in a place of basically saying you have to be some kind of techno-optimist to be a patriotic citizen of America or the Western world, in the sense that you have to think that technology can be used for good, but you also have to be a realist and sometimes a pessimist about what you need to do to actually master tech. And so in terms of like how my views have changed, just in the 5 years since I wrote that book, yeah, I do think there's a lot of evidence that we're moving out of a period of stagnation into a period of greater innovation, with obviously AI as the dominant example. I also think, though, it's relative to some other forms of tech, the downsides of AI are pretty obvious. And the challenge of mastering the tech rather than having it master us seems to be a tremendously difficult one. So in that sense, I have both more optimism and more pessimism, maybe, than I did 5 years ago. More optimism about possibilities, more pessimism about dangers. But that tends to be the way of things once history sort of starts moving, I think. Dangers increase and possibilities increase together. I don't know.
We hope you're enjoying Project Cosmos, conversations on the future of civilization. If you'd like more content like this, please like and subscribe or sign up for our newsletter, the Intercollegiate Review, in the comments section.
Matthew.
So actually, when Frank was talking about coming here and seeing Cloverleaf, I was sad for a moment, kind of put out. I thought, oh my gosh, he stole my opening gambit. But no, he was some kind of traffic formation. Does anyone know what this specimen is?
A four-leaf clover?
Fallen apart a bit. No, it's a buckhorn plantain. It's that little thing you see growing in the sidewalks everywhere in the upper Midwest. Everybody's seen it a million times. All you have to do is walk around for 5 seconds. But just out of curiosity, who here knew the name of it?
I didn't.
It didn't register for you as anything except like...
To be clear, I'm not from the upper Midwest.
They have it there too. It's not like a New Haven style pizza thing. There you might also see the broadleaf plantain, the same thing but bigger leaves. Anyway, to me, the thing about technology and the reason that you can't have some kind of nice in between, well thought out, safe position is that it has brought us to a situation where people are so alienated from their surroundings. And it gets worse and worse all the time. Once upon a time, there was a world where, people used the technology of the automobile to get in their car and drive really fast and go from this place to this place. But they were still interacting with, north, south, east, west, and the roads and sort of intuiting things or consulting maps or whatever. Now, it is astonishing to meet drivers, 10, 15 years younger than me, who don't know their way around the town or city or region in which they grew up. Because even driving to them is a matter of consulting, this thing. Every aspect of everyone's existence is digitally augmented. People are in a better position to recognize, the name, or face of someone they'll never meet on the other side of the world than they are a plant that you literally see 1,000 times a day and have seen 1,000 times a day, if you walk around. And that's assuming you walk around. That's assuming that you don't, that you haven't transformed what used to be just the most basic aspect of human life, like getting up and going to a place, using your legs, doesn't become this weird fetishized thing where like you sit at your desk and then you get in your car and then you go to a little like box in a plaza somewhere and you run really fast or like do this so that you can, optimize like the number of calories you burned. I mean, I don't even know where to begin. I think that we live in a horrifying dystopian society, and the collapse that Ross wants to forestall, I only want to prevent reluctantly, and I kind of long for it. But just to give you a sense, like what does resistance to it look like? How did I get here today? See this? Mm-hmm. I talked to my sister, who's a native, and I made this map. That wasn't so bad, was it? Old tech.
So, question for you though, Matthew, is this, so if this started, as Ross was saying, in the 12th century, there's this framework, the 12th century, scholasticism, beginning of this Faustian age, that sort of is also deeply embedded within at least the Western Christian tradition. Where would you, if this cataclysm were to happen, or accelerate to that point, where do you see this problem having emerged?
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem. Because I certainly agree with Ross that there's no kind of discrete, neatly defined moment before.
I mean, there's 1997.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we can agree, surely, that 1997 was a pretty good time.
Yeah, after Woodstock.
Or Matthew and I at least.
But
what's your reason for 1997?
I was 17. No, actually, I do have an extended defense of the late 1990s as the actual peak culturally and in other ways of sort of this phase of American history. But probably that just reflects the fact that I was, about to go to college then.
And I was 7, equally good, but very different age.
You were only 7?
Yeah.
Wow, okay, then never mind. I can't recruit you. Maybe Aaron will help me.
I think it's interesting. I mean, these are interesting questions. I think the way, if I'm understanding some of your framing, John, is like, how do we think about technology, especially in the light of cultural decline and the Jewish and Christian tradition and Western civilization? And you talk about, the 12th century. I mean, if you think about, say, the advent of capitalism, that's even earlier. That's 8th, 9th, 10th century. And that those institutions of capitalism, you have obviously a lot of technological development in that period. And I would say, I think the way I try to think about this, and it's not perfect, obviously, but that we have to make a distinction between technology and then the technological society. Mm-hmm. And so, as Matthew talks about his pen, like if you've read Techno-Optimism it's great, by Neil Postman. Once you start writing, you lose that technology. He talks about you lose the gift of memory.
Memorization. That's right.
So the guy who knows the 300 or the 3,000 proverbs now is just kind of a quack. Why do you need those? Because you can write. And so technology is always shaping us. And then the question is, how do we relate to our tools, right? Are the tools, and tools always shape us. I mean, so it's not just like McLuhan's idea of like, this, the medium is the message. Tools shape us, right? So the sword shapes us, the gun shapes us, everything. But how do we relate then to that? But I do think, so you always have this problem of technology, and technological change creates cultural change. But I think two things that are worth considering as we talk about this. So in the technology side, let's say in the Jewish and Christian tradition, part of this goes back to anthropology, which you brought up, Frank. So human beings are made in the image of God with reason and will. We have a social nature, and we work. And so we're called to complete creation. And so we invent. And so it's interesting, like in the Jewish Siddur, there are prayers where you bless the Lord when somebody invents something, right? Because you're like, wow, this is great. Like somebody invented eyeglasses or a hearing aid or, something that can fix my hair. I don't know, whatever. But you're going to invent there's this rejoicing in that. And there's a sense of technology being like a part of the image of God, where we create stuff and we complete creation. Technology also, in the biblical tradition, is a danger, right? I mean, it's like, whether you think about it in medieval ideas of like the golem, right? Where you think about it in ideas of that we somehow think, with the Tower of Babel, of course, right there is this idea, let's burn bricks and let's make a name for ourselves. So that we're going to create the way to heaven through technological elements as opposed to receive it from God. So we're given a name, God gives Abraham a name, or we're going to make a name for ourselves. Okay, and that, I think that, so the technological society then is this constant tension. And I do think you could say, and here I'm following like Christopher Dawson, he says, like the driving force of culture is religion, it's cultus. And I think he's insightfully says, well, what's the cultus of modernity? Well, it's technology. And so I would say we've moved to this primacy of the technical, where if it's technically possible, then we should do it, right? And so that's a problem, right? Because now we're like, oh, well, if you can make designer babies, then you should make designer babies, right? And so no idea of commutative justice, no idea of morality, no idea of anything else. It's just the primacy of the technical. What is technically possible should be done. And the second part, I would say, of the primacy of the technical, which is technological society, is this idea that there is going to be a technical solution to the problems of evil, sin, suffering, and death. And so and I think partially like what Matthew is partially getting to, and we would probably disagree on certain things, is that there's, in the technological society, which is where we live now, this is why you think it's, how did you use it, like the word, if it's like the kind of the landscape is horrific. And I think like there's dystopian. Well, yeah, there's a dystopian element. And I think that dystopian element, there's more to say here. So let me just stop now and let others comment. But I think part of the dystopian element is that we don't simply live in a world where we use technology and technology shapes us and we have to somehow overcome that and wrestle through that. We also live in a world where that's the case and has always been the case, as Ross points out, but also a whole technological society, which shapes the way, like the technology itself is it's not just more technology, but we've accepted the Tower of Babel as the narrative, and that's become the narrative. And even those of us who are Christians, so I'm a Catholic, we still are infected by this. And I think like Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI writes about this, I think very, very clearly. The great Italian philosopher Augusto Del Noce, he gives this example, which we can talk about later, of pure bourgeois, that we took, and you dealt with this actually. This was interesting because I listened to your interview that Johnny sent with Mark Andreessen. And do you remember when you asked him about the California ideology and he kind of went through the problems of that? I don't know if you've read Del Noce yet, but Del Noce is fantastic. And he essentially makes the argument for the California ideology in the 40s, 50s, 60s. And before he died in 89, he said, and I think this is related, he said, communism failed in the East as it realized itself in the West. And he said, well, what happened? And I'll just do this quickly, but he said, well, three things. One, in the 50s, we began to shift in our defense against communism from Christian moral principles to, we're going to beat the communists on productivity, liberation, and sexual liberation. And Del Noce said, these are Marxist values. So you have the Marxification of capitalism, if you want to call it that. Second, you have the sexual revolution, which is the extension of Marxism. Right? So family, private property, religion, these things are obstacles, this present form of marriage. And so he connects that, we can talk about it. And then the third thing he says, which is the California ideology, he says, the hippie becomes a yuppie. And so the hippie rejects what? Technology, tradition, family, religion, and there's kind of a back to the land movement, the sense of like the organic and everything. And actually, so I personally have always had like a disdain for hippies, okay? But it was Benedict XVI who gave me an appreciation of hippies, right? Like, okay, well, that's true. And I actually I'm into that stuff anyway, like organic stuff and all that kind of stuff. I like that stuff. So there's a certain aspect of de-technologifying everything. So like, we don't have to, everything is empty processed food. You can use a pen, you can read, you can have chickens, you can eat eggs. You don't have to have like, egg whites in your thing that you pour out. And so I think there's this element there. But what happened is the hippie needs a job. The hippie has to get involved in the economy. And so then the hippie fully buys into the commercial society while rejecting religion, morality, marriage, etc. And so the hippie becomes a yuppie. And you combine that with the techno-utopianism of Silicon Valley, and you get the California ideology. And so what Del Noche says is we move from Christian bourgeois, where markets and technology, trade, etc., are all constrained by a moral vision of justice, specifically commutative justice. And now they're set free to techno-optimism, efficiency, and whatever it might be. So I think I just find when I think about technology, making those distinctions between what is technology qua technology and how do we think about that, and then what is the technological society. And I would say I'm for the proper use of technology constrained by a moral vision of the universe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I could develop. And I'm fundamentally opposed to the technological society.
You mentioned though, Michael, about technology shapes us. And Matthew, you mentioned what the technology does to us. I mean, there's still agency.
Of course. No one doubts agency, but that doesn't mean...
But because I'm guessing when you say this society's dystopian, and by the way, I'm not a utopian about this at all. I'm probably surprisingly more wary of it. But you're not living a dystopian life, are you?
I think...
I mean, the technology, if it controls us, if it shapes us, and it has control over us, then you are ipso facto living a dystopian life because that's what we've created. But I'm guessing just by what you don't seem to be living a dystopian life.
Oh no, I definitely think I am. No, I mean I'm like Winston Smith going off to visit the junk shop and sit upstairs or whatever, for
on a daily basis. You're in a dystopian.
You're not the savage in Brave New World hanging out just outside the border.
What does the Ayn Rand one do? He has sex in the woods. No, that's Winston too. What? I'm trying to go through my dystopias to figure out which I am. But no, I mean I think we all live in a dystopian society, and one of the most horrifying things actually.
No, but the question is your life dystopian? Because to call the whole society dystopian, then I guess my life is dystopian too. But there's still this human agency aspect with regard to the technology.
Yeah, but hold on. You're not let you answer that. I just think the question is not a great one because the facts are you have Alexander Solzhenitsyn living a heroic moral life in a dystopian concentration camp. I mean, the question is not whether Matthew's living a dystopian life.
No, I know
that does he live in a dystopian society that's forcing everything upon him.
I appreciate that, but it's actually not my question. It's not my question. My question is, how much does the technology? You're rejecting a lot of it. You drew your own map.
That's right.
Okay, but to Ross's point, this stuff's gone on for 800, 900 years.
Sure, but I'm a person who is lucky enough to have a certain amount of leisure time, and who benefited by hook or by crook from a decent, especially primary school education, thanks to some old hippie teachers in an experimental multi-age classroom. But here's the difference, and this is to me is in some ways the most horrifying aspect of the whole thing, is to me the worst things about the technological society fall into this pattern that we've seen over and over again, where the innovation is seized upon by people at the top of the class ladder and praised, and they have the social capital to use it if they want to or not use it or whatever, and then they come around, they realize that it's bad, but by then it's made its way down the class ladder. And this is everything from like Wonder Bread to no-fault divorce to infant formula. You think about the introduction of infant formula. These guys in their lab coats are actually suggesting, as if this were possible, like we've concocted something in a lab that is better than human mammalian mother's milk could ever possibly be for infants. And instead, it's like Puerto Rican women, in New York, who are the last remaining, the people to nurse their children, right? Now we have women who are CEOs of Fortune 500 companies who have suites, full floors as big as this one that just exist for them to go and, put breast milk in bottles or whatever. And meanwhile, the only people using breast milk are women who are using infant formula are people for whom the government buys infant formula, right? And it's the same thing with technology, right? People in Ross's world, are spending more than the American median income.
People in my world?
To send to,
what is my world?
Upper middle class, white,
sure,
professional.
That's fair. No, I just want to be sure that we're being fair. Yes, that's completely fair.
Intelligent.
I thought you meant cool bald people, because that's another
fantasy. No,
not that.
To send their children to schools which are advertised, primarily on the basis that the kids aren't using iPads, right? Meanwhile, if you go out to the elementary schools in the town where I live, we toured one time. You talk about dystopia. I mean, as if I just compare it to my 90s childhood, we're thinking about sending our son who has special needs, as we would say now, to the local public school, in order to facilitate homeschooling a little bit. Let's see if these things that we already spent a lot on taxes or whatever, like, let's see if we can get something out of it, if they can help them a little bit, and we go in. The first thing I noticed is, like, you can't just walk into this building anymore. You have to, punch a little code, like when I was a kid, you just walked into the school building, you have to punch this crazy code. You have to confirm that there's an appointment. And then these utterly sloppy people wearing Chinese textiles. When I was growing up, an elementary school principal wore a purple pantsuit with a little themed pin. Like she would have a pumpkin one on today, or she would have a turkey one. It's just some lady wearing athleisure comes up and starts extolling the virtues of kindergartners being on iPads for 6 hours a day, And
I want to get actually Aaron in here because Aaron he actually does live in a utopia, Carmel.
Yeah.
It's wealthy, it's prosperous, it's walkable, religious, and you're more optimistic. So what do you?
Yeah, I mean, this stuff doesn't compute for me at all, frankly, on a lot of it.
Sorry, what stuff? Sorry.
But what you guys are saying about technology, and I feel like if you look at America, we are great at inventing technologies, but we didn't invent all the technologies. I don't think we invented the steam engine or the automobile or photography, but we marry technological innovation with its development, application at scale, and that is why the United States created the modern world. We are the protean nation, right, that conquered a continent and, laid the telegraph lines and the railroad lines and, the highways and built the airports and put a man on the moon and, created, wonderful penicillin and all this stuff that we have. And that's the nature of our country. It's the kind of country that we are. And yes, I've written lots of what we've lost with industrial society. More so than technology, and its destruction of the house. I've written that. There are trade-offs in any system.
And the trade-off is that the poorest Americans, millions and millions of them, these kids are morbidly obese and spend 6 hours a day.
Your vision
at
is completely
home.
dystopian, because what you're basically saying is my moral vision of society should essentially prevail over what everybody else wants. I mean, it's an almost Orwellian.
They want that. I don't think that there's any question of volition involved when mom who has to work the coupon center at CVS and dad, assuming he can pass his drug test, is working at the components manufacturing plant and their kids have to go to public school. There's no question of volition involved in whether or not their kids spend 6 hours a day on an iPad as opposed to, a textbook. Reading, writing, arithmetic. Where's the question of volition there? What?
I mean, look, I grew up in rural southern Indiana. I know this place as well. They love that stuff. Yeah. Do they make choices I think are good? No. Do I think that like we all have like?
Am I my brother's keeper?
Yeah,
Give me a break.
This is a classic. This is the classic, frankly, Catholic discussion. That
The best, the greatest.
Catholicism has always been much more techno-skeptical than Protestantism. This is a Protestant country.
Am I my brother's
And
keeper? Come on, give me.
So first of all, I would say we invented capitalism and the internet. So, but can I ask you a serious question though?
Get away. We just cured cystic fibrosis. If you didn't know that.
Great.
Like
He promises you science. He promises you enlargement of mind. He promises you civil liberty. He bids you mount aloft. He grasps you by the hand, and then you're his guy.
Well,
So
I'm gonna say,
can
like,
I ask
this
a
is
serious
I would love to put your future of America to the vote of the people and say, do you want to invent going back to hand scribbled maps, and we're getting rid of all this technology, and we're going to go live like Wendell Berry?
Yeah, and they'll vote for porn and FanDuel. 24/7 online gambling.
but this-
What a great idea! It's so popular.
Again, you
Who
want
cares
to,
if it's popular?
You want to essentially dominate society so you can impose your vision.
No, I have
it's
no
unlikely.
I have
I think
no
it's unlikely.
illusions about the ability, as Gibbon says in that wonderful chapter. I have no illusions about the ability of a censor to restore the morals of society. Any attempt to implement at a broad scale to restore, what I think is a more healthily ordered attitude towards technology would be experienced as what Gibbon calls vexatious oppression. So no, that's why I'm completely pessimistic and I'm longing for the collapse.
So
Ross Douthat.
why don't I?
And I have a question for Aaron too, but go ahead.
Ask Aaron a question.
so
then
just-
I'll
I
attempt
guess-
to synthesize.
Okay, so one of my questions about this, I think that's an interesting. So, like I tried to say earlier, I do think we need to make a distinction between technological society and technology, because I'm not a pessimist about technological invention. I think technological invention is a very positive thing. Curing cystic fibrosis. I mean, we're using CRISPR technologies to actually cure sickle cell anemia. I mean, there's amazing things going on. I also don't think we should be using CRISPR technologies, in vitro, right? And I don't think we should follow He-Jin Cui, who created twin embryos who are immune to HIV. They're HIV resistant. Think about this. Those little girls are born. Well, if you are in a pure technological society and you're separated from any kind of moral question, then you say, well, why don't we create replicants, to use the Blade Runner? They could be gonorrhea free, STD free, sterile, and then they can be used for elite pleasure. I mean, so like so the thing is, it's not as because I don't want the replicant, therefore I don't want to cure cancer. I think those are we have to make that distinction. That's why I was trying to make the distinction between technological society and technology. And so, I mean, I would say in some ways we probably agree, but I think part of it you guys want to go back to the Middle Ages. I mean, that's just not a serious argument. The real question is how do we make the distinction of what's appropriate and how do we address these things? But I would say the other question I have for you is there's a difference also between the technology and then applying technology and social engineering. So we used the idea, we won World War II. We've won the peace. We're the greatest country in the world. We've conquered so let's conquer poverty. Well, what we ended up doing is we bulldozed communities. 49% of them were African American. The other 51% were immigrants. That's us, we weren't, Irish and German immigrants and Jews. And we said, it's a messy slum and we'll just bulldoze it, and then we'll build public housing and freeways. And so what we did is we destroyed the natural communities where people flourish. We destroyed privately held businesses. We abused eminent domain in the name of technology. And so I think, would you say that's fine? I mean, that's the collateral damage of the technological society. Or could we make distinctions between let's use railroads, get railroads, and let's build cars, and let's build airplanes, and let's cure cystic fibrosis, but let's not apply technology where it shouldn't be applied in trying to socially engineer human beings. How do you respond to that?
I mean, I think the idea that we have no brakes on technology in America, we always, there was a Christian ethos applied to society at some level, of course, imperfectly. So what did we have? We had the progressive movement that in part was about dealing with the fallout of, industrial modernity. And we had antitrust regulation, we had immigration reform, we had the playground movement. We had the high school movement. We had conservation, producing national parks. We passed various environmental laws. So we've always had, with this technological development, we've always had something of doing it. Now, I think what happens with Silicon Valley, and this is where I do agree we've got a problem, is we've entered into essentially a, post-Christian, post-Protestant America in which many of those impulses are now restrained by any sort of religious vision.
Well, that's the technological society.
And so you end up with transhumanism and they raise Kurzweil and a lot of the Silicon Valley and rationalism and effective altruism and all of that. I think the other is we end up with essentially, the old Protestant work ethic culture is essentially run out of gas. The cultural contradictions of capitalism have come up against us. Even the modern contemporary evangelical is not, austere, thrifty, hardworking.
So but then you are passing judgment on
that's
the obese person giving their kid an iPad.
Right. And I think part of it is, we do have, and I'm very, I would be very forthright and say, it is a role of government and of leadership to, in essence, elevate our people and to set rules and to impose things. Yeah, I'm willing to know that, but I'm not trying to say it's, my preferred dials or some sort of, this is the moral way to live, and therefore that. It's a pragmatic, prudential judgment, which we will always get wrong because we're fallen human beings. And by the way, we're going to give an account to God for how we did it. So living life in that idea that we're going to give an account. And so, I think those are some of the things. But I think this idea that this very timid view of the future, I think is just something it's a break from our culture in America, which has always been forward-looking, protean, constantly changing.
Is protean an adjective with positive connotations?
I think it is in America. In the context of American culture, it may not be in...
Who was Proteus?
Yeah.
Who was Proteus?
Well, protean is a verb or an adjective.
And what's it derived from? Who's Proteus?
I don't care what it's derived from. I care what the dictionary says the definition.
Yeah, the dictionary would tell you about Proteus.
Yeah. And so I think, but the point is this is our culture. And if you want to reject America, which I think a lot of people do, that's fine. Say that we reject American culture.
Don't be dismissive. Tell us what your point is.
Yeah, but I also think reject. it's not a question of rejecting America. It's it's just
and the other thing is, you said
there
are prudential limits and a sense of pragmatism. Like nothing that I said about how, when I was talking about why I don't think it's good for children, in kindergarten to spend 6 hours a day on an iPad. How is that incompatible with what you were saying about the application of prudence or sort of a pragmatic check on technology?
But you say you live in a dystopia. I don't think we live in a dystopia at all.
Suppose we say, though, that societies can create dystopias within themselves that are not all-encompassing.
Of course.
And that technological change can do this quite rapidly, right? So if you drop back in time to various points in the Industrial Revolution and walked around a factory floor, London at various points, any industrial city at various points under either maximal conditions of human squalor and child labor or maximal conditions of pollution.
Or gin houses.
You would say this is dystopian, and it often was. It's dark satanic mills. It's all the rest. At the same time, that was not the all-encompassing reality of those societies. The America that had squalid factory conditions was also the America that was, developing in many of the ways that Aaron just suggested. But then the other thing is that those dystopias were, to some degree, tamed and mastered and reformed and improved, right? And so, I feel like Matthew can very easily, talk me into the idea that internet culture and digital life is creating a particular kind of dystopia that is felt most intensely maybe by, it's felt most intensely by different groups, by people who are most addicted to online porn or online gambling. But also I think, it's totally plausible to say that working class and lower class adoptions of technologies for kids that upper class people are now stepping away from is in its own way dystopian. And AI holds out insanely dystopian possibilities. Like, they're right there in the advertising material. The people who are like, well, you have to invest in us because there's, in the end, there's only going to be one company left and it's going to rule the whole world. And, probably the machine God it builds will kill us all. So please give to our next seed round, right? Like that, it's all right there. I think the question that I wrestle with is there a way to deal with this besides saying, like, we're going somewhere and we have to avoid the darkest destinations while sort of riding the kind of civilization that we're in? And I do agree with Aaron, like, this is the kind of civilization we have. And the experience of America in periods when economic growth slows down and technological change slows down is not some pretty pastoral. I think you'd agree with me. Like, this, in some ways, the post-industrial Midwest has been less dynamic, less technologically innovative over the last 40 years. But
some of the dystopia is precisely that.
Right. People are not returning to nature and learning the name of Buckhorn plantain. Buckhorn plantain. Right. I made my own attempt to lead a pastoralist life, and it ended very badly. So I offer that as my excuse for not knowing the botanical names that I should. But I think you can, to me, it seems like in early 21st century America, there are sort of two broad options. One is you're riding the tiger, you're going forward with technology, and you're trying desperately to get the cystic fibrosis cure and the flying cars without getting the AI nightmare. And we can talk about which one is more likely. Or you're stagnating into a kind of, you still have enough technology to sink into it along the lines that you fear and loathe for good reason. Plus you have opioids and you have, sort of post-religious decay and all kinds of other things. And I don't see a third option.
May I try a third? And I think I probably agree. So I'm being a little bit like provocative on purpose, but I would say, in one sense, like, I think you're right. So you have to somehow figure out how you're going to solve this. I don't think we're going to say moratorium on technology. That's not going to happen, right?
Well, no. There are people, right, including very smart people who I respect a great deal, who look at AI, right, and say, you need a moratorium on this technology, not because it could create a dystopia, but because the dystopia it could create is so comprehensive. And I have sympathy for that argument. I don't think it's a crazy argument at all. I'm just, anyway, not...
No, thank you.
But it is an end of the world kind of thing, like nuclear weapons.
Right.
That's different from an iPad, which may be terrible or not, but it doesn't end civilization.
No, that's it's important to make that distinction. And I think there's also calling for moratoriums on CRISPR gene editing, right? I mean, they've called for that. It's not going to last, but and I think there's some serious problems that we have to address. I think, but backing out just a bit, I think part of the challenge we have, and this is why I brought up the technological society, is in one sense we're looking for a technical solution to the problem of our technology, right? And that meaning, I don't mean digital. I mean, like, if we can create this political system, we're going to solve the problem. And I think that and this goes back to kind of something you said, Ross, made me think of it, is that we have deep cultural problems at this point. And I think part of our cultural problems, and here's where I think I would agree maybe with Aaron, maybe not, like, we've left some of the American experiment. And part of there's, in a sense, two Americas. We always talk about two Americas. Well, I'll give you two new Americas, right? There's the Tocquevillian America of decentralization, of communities, of associations, and local politics and religion and family. And that's part of what makes America unique and great. And as he described, the difference between, say, England or France and America. And then there is the progressive, and I don't just mean progressive politics, but like the technocratic America, okay, of which both right and left are part of. That, we can, again, we've got to the moon, so now we're going to create the standard American diet. And what happened? Well, everybody got obese and sick. Where, Mariana Mazzucato, the famous Italian economist, she's talking about, we need moonshots. And we need a moonshot America. We're like, think, we got to the moon, we solved this. We also had the moonshot of the war on poverty. We had the moonshot of the Great Society we had the moonshot of the standard American diet, right? I mean, there are more, but my point is, I think what I would say is there's actually, and I've been thinking about this, you can correct me and others can correct me. I think there's maybe a very interesting possibility for decentralized ledger technology, right? Blockchain, to be a technological augmentation for decentralization. And because I know, at least I think this is true, and I've written about this, I don't think you can build decentralized communities, a Tocquevillian vision, if you want to call it, the Tocqueville option, right, if you want to call it that, on centralized technology. You have to build decentralization on decentralized technology. So in fact, some of the invention of decentralized ledger technology, blockchain, could actually be an augmentation to decentralization, so that you're not relying upon highly centralized servers. I could be wrong.
Could you tell me what that means? Because whenever somebody says to me, blockchain.
Yeah. Digital subsidiarity, Ross.
Right. No. Okay. But in practice, let's say I am the mayor of Batavia, New York, or I am, the leader of a religious community setting up camp in southwestern Indiana, and I want to build a Tocquevillian paradise. Tell me, what does blockchain technology do? What do I do with it?
So first of all, I don't think you can build Tocquevillian paradises. I don't think they're possible, and I don't think you can build any paradise because I'm not utopian. However,
a Tocquevillian, decent Tocquevillian society in which people still commit adultery and murder.
Yeah, good. That's possible.
Okay.
So I mean, again, I don't know this. I'm not a technologist. So part of this is a question. That's why I said I could be wrong. But I think what I think could happen is that with decentralized ledger, you have clear evidence, right? And you're recording in a ledger of things that are happening. So for example, the church could take sacramental records and they put them on a decentralized ledger. Those are now protected so that being in a centralized ledger, we've talked about Orwell here. Stalin said the past is, the future is certain. They used to joke, right? Under Stalin's regime, the future is certain. It's the past we're unsure of. That can be changed. I think one of the things, I don't mean you could always somehow perfectly resist the state. But if you look at, say, for example, property rights in developing economies, where they're very insecure, if you could connect GPS and blockchain and you register a property, and even if that, like a bad regime overtakes that is still going to exist. So then that bad regime is gone. You're able to say, okay, this was the property I had. If you have your sacramental records or you have other school records on a decentralized ledger, and you're not reliant upon Google or other banking where you can get deplatformed so easily, right? This gives you a certain sense of autonomy and freedom as a community, not just an individual, to resist. Now, it may be the case, and this is important, that the state says, we're going to shut you down. Well, if the major state's going to shut you, let me just finish. The major state's going to shut you down. Either they're going to use force, or they're going to they can at least shadow shut you down if you have control of your technology. And this is what I mean by, I think there's a place for technological augmentation to decentralization. I might be wrong, but
I don't think centralization. You offer it as a hypothesis. I'm not sure centralization is the core of the issue here. I want to offer first of all, to your point about we've had dystopias all kind. I mean, you said the Gulag was dystopia. It didn't need technology to be dystopian. So I think.
But it was technology. It was actually. I mean, if you think of
so is fire. So is fire. Just as you said. Let me finish.
Technology.
Let me finish.
Okay.
No, I don't mean digital technology, but technology is the entirety of it, okay? Television started out, it wasn't digital, now it's digital. Right. It's still television, okay? It seems to me what we worship, if you had to say what are the critical elements to dystopia, it's what we worship. I think that the digital technology is happening so fast now that the reaction to it is taking a while. Let me just give you one piece of technology that really totally transformed society. It's what Marshall McLuhan, one of the ones he was talking about was television. Yeah. And I mean, honestly, I'm about 15 to 20 years older than most of y'all. Somewhere 15 years older, okay?
We already established I'm much older than Matthew.
the amount of I had two loving parents, okay, and mom was at home. The amount of television we watched. My brother and I had a 2-hour-long conversation with nothing but television lines, okay, with useless information in our heads.
Oh, yeah.
And it took a generation, or maybe a generation and a half, to respond to that, because you don't quite see the ramification. That doesn't make it better in the moment, the iPads, but I cut down on the amount of television my daughter watch, and my grandchildren don't watch any. So, because there's this kind of realization, my grandfather died of smoking cigarettes, which in a way is a technology. We figured out how to roll tobacco leaves into this thing that was incredibly pleasant, so pleasant that people wanted to have one in their mouth all day long, and he died at 58. And after a while you say, well, that's not such a good idea. Maybe I'm not gonna smoke. And so I do think right now it's that the pace is so rapid that the reaction to it. But honestly, when I see the way you're living, I'm seeing more and more people. I mean, the reaction's happening.
But that's the difference, right? Is that I'm someone who writes and thinks about things for a living, and I have a certain amount of latitude in how I arrange my day-to-day life, right? Again, the guy who works at a components manufacturing plant and the woman works at CVS or whatever, they don't have the time to think through all of this. They just have to accept whatever, the worst kind of prevailing paradigm is. And that's why I'm interested, in what I was thinking about what Aaron said about the progressive movement. And, if there's any way to forestall that collapse that I do kind of long for, it is the possibility of something equivalent to that catalog that you produced, but suited to the problems of our age. And this is where I have to confess, I don't think decentralization is the solution to anything. One thing that I agree with Andreessen in his manifesto about is that I have a certain attraction to Promethean myths, and my favorite Promethean myth is the story of FDR, the Lightbringer.
You mean literally with electrification?
Yeah, right? Yeah. In some cases,
just to be clear,
yeah,
what we're talking about. Yeah,
but I think it would be great if we could do what is, as far as I can tell, European countries, which among other things have lower obesity rates and also healthier, more thriving print cultures than we have, are actually doing things like saying, we're going to ban, digital technology in the classroom. We are going to make, we're going to think through some of these curricular choices and stuff. But what would it look like to try to accept, the technological conditions that exist? We're not going back absent some kind of total collapse, right? Most people, you would say, do not want to go back to a world where you have to use, let's just go through all of it. People don't want to barter. They don't want to carry around really heavy coins, right? They don't necessarily even just want to use paper money. They don't want to, maybe you would remember the days of etchings for credit cards. What were those things?
I had one at the grocery store.
I remember those.
So those, but once in a while, like in the furthest in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan where I grew up, if you went way out west, even when I was a kid,
still have to.
But nobody wants to go back to all of that. I understand that. But how do we incorporate the benefits of technology, such as they are, or just the unavoidable realities of them, in a way that does not subsume all of ordinary social life into these digital platforms, that does not colonize our attention spans, that does not deform our imaginations? How do we make the benefits something that are just kind of there in the background? And what that would look like, I don't know, but I think the biggest thing for me is that it's not going to be a technological solution, it's going to be a political solution. But the most horrifying thing about the conditions that obtain in a technological society like ours is that the technology itself actually has made political solutions, any kind of political solutions to any problem, far less likely. Because the paradigm we live in now is what some of our left-wing friends call hyperpolitics, right? Politicization without political consequences, right? Think in your head of like Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law, right? It's we smirk because this idea that like engaged citizen statesmen petition their elected representatives for remission of to address some grievance, right? And they think about it prudentially, and then they speak with their colleagues and deliberate about it. This is not what Congress is. Congress exists to have these kind of showboating hearings.
We're about to see a real life example of it over the next 12 months. And the real life example is going to be, because you're right, a lot of it's paralyzed, but our biggest entertainment industry in this country has got to figure out what to do with gambling now. And it'll be interesting to see whether, obviously the accelerant has been that you can gamble nonstop because the odds are fed to you and you can up and you can the whole game, right? You can't just find a bookie and bet on one.
But we made a political and moral choice to lean into that.
And now look at what happened, and it will be interesting to see.
What happened?
Huh?
What happened?
For those who don't follow pro basketball.
Okay.
Go on.
Yeah. We have a huge
Not that any viewers of this
This may be the biggest scandal since the
White
Black
Sox.
Sox.
The Black Sox.
They got named the Black Sox.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, that's like 100 years.
Yeah.
And we now have a situation where, I was reading about it this morning. I can't remember New York Times or what. This is a real crisis because this is massive entertainment for most of our country, and the integrity of the game itself is under challenge more than at any other time.
So I think these things are correct because with the kids, they're not fundamentally at the end of the day technological problems. They're problems of the moral bankruptcy of our leadership class. These opioid
and of
painkillers-
entrepreneurs.
Yeah, the opioid
hero
painkiller is
entrepreneurs.
just like it's the Sackler family and these people who are willing to profit off of gambling, or they're willing to profit off of legalized drugs, profit off of opioids, do whatever it takes to make a buck. I think more greed, unrestrained greed, is a much bigger component than unrestrained technology. Because you say we've had the human condition hasn't changed, and that I think it's easy to it's not fundamentally a technological issue. Most of these problems,
but which is more
porn
of a
is not a
constant in human
technological
history,
issue
greed
per
or
se.
technology? Are you suggesting the level of greed just went up suddenly? I think that is obviously.
I think Aaron would argue reasonably that the level of Protestantism went down, and that Protestantism, more than Catholicism, I would say, was historically very interested in regulating vice in America, right? And and this extends to the current religious right has very little to say about gambling. Has more to say about pornography, but very little to say about gambling and things related to these issues in ways that would have been surprising even to the Protestants of 1985 or something.
I agree.
Right? So that's
I agree completely.
But the tech also matters, right? And with pornography, right? Like having
Such an accelerant.
grown up, right? The dynamics. I don't actually recommend that people read the cover story, or not sure if it's a cover story, but there's a big essay in the latest Harper's about essentially sort of the cult of masturbation on the internet. I don't recommend reading it exactly, but it is a very well done piece for what it is, and it's a case study in something that again would not have been possible in a world without not just pornography, but it's pornography meets the algorithm, right? Where it's like you were given something, and then your preferences are reinforced and accelerated, and so on, and that's a novel thing that is distinct from prior moral challenges that the Protestants of yore went to war against.
Jaron Lanier, you've read his book, 10 Arguments.
You are not a gadget.
There's that one, but he has another one called 10 Arguments to Delete Your Social Media, which is excellent. And I'll defend decentralization later, and decentralization is important, I think, but it's the Tocquevillian in me. Anyway, but I do think just to I think you're right. It's clearly a moral problem, and even the point that Del Noce makes that we've gone to pure bourgeois is the technological society. It's that in fact, anything that's possible is possible, right? That's part of the loss of the moral the bankruptcy. But I do think, like, if you act to linear stuff, and I think, Ross, you make an important point that you have data scientists, psychologists, and neuroscientists actually work, and computer scientists working on algorithms to bring you in to the lucrative porn industry, to bring you in to the gambling industry. And so, like Lanier says, you know, it's like he gives this talk. It's very a good talk, and he says, you know, he was talking, I think it's Marvin Minsky or somebody, and they said, like, do you think it's possible to do a Skinner box, like basically treat everybody and behavior modify? And he's like, no. The only way that you could actually behavior modify people is if they were connected to a behavior modification device all the time. And Lanier like holds up a phone, and everybody goes like, "Oh my goodness!" Right? And it's just great. He did this maybe like 10 years ago, but it's like, but I do think he says we are being treated like lab animals. So I think that you're absolutely right. It's a moral thing. I also believe in agency, but I think that's why this is such.
Well, that's why I believe it's a moral thing, because we do have agency.
Yeah. So that's why it's such a complex issue, because you have agency, you have communal collapse, decentralization, you have family breakdown, you have the loss of the Protestant, cultural aspects, but you also have incredibly sophisticated behavior modification technology that is weakening your agency and then making you an addiction. So just as you become addicted to opioids, like 10 to 15% of people are physiologically going to become addicted to opioids. It's not an agency question at a certain point. So, and this is like in the Catholic tradition, we have the culpability levels, right? So like culpability is dropping partially because of behavior modification.
Michael, this is good. You've identified an incremental piece of the technology today that might have been there subtly in the past, but that is there in a gargantuan way now. Is the behavior modification part. Mm-hmm. So it is true that the cigarette ads were designed, but the pace at which they modified your behavior, the pace at which the industrial society modified your behavior, that pace was way slower than the pace at which technology is modifying.
So, Michael, you're making the point that the technological society is part of the problem. There was a period in time in America where we were creating, innovating, but there was a constraint. You know, there was sort of a Christian, particularly a Protestant kind of ethical framework that helped to constrain some of the excesses of technological innovation, perhaps. And so we're trying to kind of adjudicate. We would like the certain technologies, you know, like solving diseases, going to Mars, but we don't want others like.
Not, I mean, to be clear, I don't think that you don't want to go to Mars, right? Not everyone wants to go to Mars.
But I don't want to go to Mars.
Earth's a place for love.
Anyways,
okay.
But
I'm pro Mars.
Okay, all right. No, I'm pro Mars too. But so but the ability to make these
want to go there.
Moral and ethical distinctions to evaluate good uses of technology and bad. I think part of the problem is there is not a moral consensus by which we can make those decisions, because the creators of the technology, if you take Mark Andreessen's manifesto, view technology as an end in itself. There's no material problem that it can't solve. He even says technology can make the space possible for religion, but it's almost like that flows down from technological progress as the end all be all. So those are the guys that are creating the technology without regard to any of the constraints. Now, then you have the left, you know, during the Biden administration, they wanted to regulate and kind of stifle a lot of technology, especially around AI. But it felt to me, or it seemed to me, like a lot of the limits they wanted to impose on it were from the framework of DEI and, you know, kind of green principles and things like that. So it's sort of a left-wing progressive social, you know, smothering of this. And then you have on the right kind of two different camps. You have probably a lot of people that voted for Republican in the last couple of elections. They don't want the designer babies like maybe the people in Ross's social circle might want, but they like the online gambling.
My social circle, to be clear, we've established it's
really fun.
Very upper middle class, but against designer babies.
Okay.
It's a fairly narrow. It's a small circle.
Anyways, and so yeah,
It's not going to be a meme.
Yeah. It could be a meme. So anyways, so the people, I think a lot of people that would vote Republican today, the bar stool kind of conservatives, they do want their sports betting and they do want the pornography, like, right? And then you have you sort of us broadly kind of Christians, right, that would want to be able to parse these distinctions and say yes and say no based on kind of Christian anthropology or Catholic social teaching or some sort of, Protestant biblical kind of moral teaching. So I feel like part of the challenge is how do we, without this shared moral framework, as a culture, make these decisions. And then the last thing I'll say is I do feel as though, and this is kind of to maybe Matthew's point, I do feel like most technology is inherently centralizing, whether it's AI, whether it's big data, whether it's go back to the Industrial Revolution, there's like a few big players, Rockefeller, et cetera. And so I think this is where the political solution, at least that came early in the 20th century with progressivism, was this attempt politically to use centralized political power to fight centralized technological and economic power. And so, anyways, I ultimately feel like this is the only thing that can save us is God, is Christ, right? Because I think all gifts that we've been given, our job as human beings is to offer the world back to God, like in a Eucharistic fashion with Thanksgiving, right? So that to me is like that's the ultimate end game, but I don't.
That's our plan.
That's the plan.
That's the plan.
Yeah. But I don't know how we get there without a political solution. But I don't know where that comes from, given that we're so divided.
Yeah, I'd like to add one other dimension to this: is we know we are kind of having a conversation as if we're the only ones that matter in a sense in America, and it's a global world with technology. And, I'm very glad that it was the United States that came to dominate the world and not Germany and not the Soviet Union. And I think if we want to talk about a dystopia in technology, I think China is that dystopia.
Totally.
And we have to, it's sort of like the atomic bomb. I wish it had never been created, but if it's been created, it was better that we created it first and not Germany. And so I think there is an element, there is maybe kind of a prisoner's dilemma in some of this stuff. And I don't think that it justifies, being in a great power competition justifies anything. But we do also have to look at, America has been the country that's created the future. I don't think we want China to create what the future is. And right now, China's creating a future. And unfortunately, it might be appealing to a lot of other countries. So I think the international competitive dimension can't be ignored.
Mm-hmm. But China regulates things like the amount of time that children can spend playing video games or whatever in ways that, nincompoop, originalist judges would say were violations of the First Amendment, as if the Founding Fathers had addressed, such questions, in their remarks about the not having a religious establishment or the right to publicly protest, right? So China, I think part of the whole story of their rise is getting Americans to adopt, embrace, and even defend, as expressions of, ordered liberty, all kinds of social pathologies, which they themselves work very strongly to curb and to limit.
That's true.
But I just want to go back to the political thing for a minute. I mean, why I'm so pessimistic about this is that, take any issue that should be a prudential issue, right? Not a first order moral question like abortion, right? But take the issue of immigration, right? No sane person believes that anybody should just be able to walk into any other country anywhere on the globe and become a citizen tomorrow, right?
I do know people. We can debate their sanity, but I do know people who believe that. But
and then I don't even know what the sort of reduction would be in the other dimension, but like people.
I also know people who hold that view.
This is Ross's
just to be clear, by social circles, that contains
people
multitudes.
who don't want to deport anybody. People who want to deport anybody who wasn't, who have at least one Mayflower ancestor or something.
Matthew, so why are you pessimistic about a political solution to this problem?
I think just because the kinds of conditions that made, say, the progressive movement or the New Deal, or even, we could disagree about, whether any of them were successful, but even the Great Society, responses to real or perceived social pathologies, economic injustices, just change, frankly, technological conditions. What made it possible for those solutions to be proposed and implemented, I don't think the conditions exist for that anymore. And the main reason is that politics in the schoolhouse rock sense, that my grandfather still, thinks he's going to find when he opens the Detroit Free Press every morning, just doesn't exist. Congress exists to do these kind of showboating hearings where we've ramped up the procedural stakes. You impeach if the other guy's in the White House, you try to impeach him. You try to ask these silly gotcha questions. You try to catch people up in these procedural crimes and send them to prison or whatever. And every issue works out like this, right? On immigration, for example, at the end of the day, what seems to satisfy the Trump base, the people who supposedly have some kind of deep-seated conviction that immigration is bad because it lowers wages or it contributes to higher crime rates or lack of social cohesion or whatever. What satisfies them is seeing Kristi Noem in a flak jacket, appear in these parodies of an 80s sci-fi dystopian movie, being the bad lady. They say, yeah, this is great, and then Atlantic readers flip out and say this is so horrifying, and that just makes them even happier. Meanwhile, we're going to go back and look at the statistics, and I wouldn't be surprised if years later we're in a situation like we were where Trump in his first term deported fewer people than Barack Obama did, and all of the outrage is ultimately the point. I can't really think of an issue that has been meaningfully addressed in a legislative way, in the old-fashioned American political sense, where we're worried about this issue and we put our heads together, and despite divided government, we come together and solve it. I just don't think that our political system exists for kind of prudential deliberation about these objects of widespread disapprobation anymore.
Let's assume you're right, they don't exist now. Okay. But they haven't existed during my lifetime, in my opinion. What I've witnessed during my lifetime for the first 50 years of my life is a growing leviathan of a government that had one trajectory. The Democrats held Congress for 45 years until the radical, attention-getting, arm-waving, crazy Newt Gingrich, and I say because he's a friend of mine, okay, and he's from Georgia, and I watched, okay, until he said, maybe we could have Congress. It was like, no, you'll upset the comity that we have together. They did. I mean, Bob Michael from Illinois, okay, that scared him to death that the Republicans might actually try to take Congress. And Newt said, well, maybe we should. He got ostracized by the first Bush administration. I mean, sent out of the Rose Garden during the signing of taxes that George Bush promised he would not raise, and then for comity, Bush raised them. So we watched for like 45, 50 years. Maybe there was more comity among members of the government because they all benefited, and Washington went from being a backwater to being a major financial corporate world capital because the power of Leviathan grew like that. So I think, regardless of MAGA or Trump, I think there are some things like the power of the Ivy League that has grown unabated for 200 years. And somebody finally stood up and said, is that a democratic process? Is that what we should be spending billions of dollars to? And so, Ross has touched on a number of these things, but I think you are seeing political change. Now, whether somebody's in a bomber jacket or whatever, I mean, there was a presidency that lasted 15 years where we cloaked the fact that he was in a wheelchair, and we had all kind of machinations to deceive the public about what was actually going on with him. So I just think we have to be careful assuming that the conditions today can't produce change. Change is happening. You may be on the side that doesn't like it, But I think the good old days of how it worked in the 70s or the 50s or the 40s, I don't know that they were any more conducive to a healthy society. Now, where our religion is as a culture, that's a big difference. That is a huge difference between today and 30 years ago, 50 years ago, and 70 years ago. But the political...
And also I think the behavior mods.
Ross, too. Your thoughts on the political solution?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think you can synthesize these points and say that American representative government looks especially dysfunctional at the moment, but to the extent that it was sort of more effective and functional in the recent past, it was just because everyone agreed on a broadly center-left perspective, right? And in neither scenario, seems like to me, is it really imaginable that you're going to get some kind of large-scale moralistic or otherwise regulation of technology. I don't think in the near term that's plausible. Which again is yet one more reason that I end up sort of saying, well, we, like it or not, we're going to have the technological future, and we sort of have to accept it. I do think what's kind of distinct about this moment is the intensity of the Skinner box modifications, right? The intensity of the addictive power of some forms of sort of social media and digital culture augmented by AI they're likely to create a kind of darkening scenario that maybe you could be optimistic about in the end, right? Which is to say a scenario where groups, people, families that just sort of succumb to the pressures of the digital just don't reproduce themselves in a way that we haven't really seen under technological pressures before. And you see this happening all over the world, as much in China, notwithstanding their attempts to regulate video games and so on, as much in China as in Western Europe, as much in East Asia and Latin America as in the US, right? So you are actually getting this kind of much more intense selection pressure, where in fact the Matthew Walther model of raising your kids somewhat outside the worst effects of technology might literally be being selected for. Like the story of the 21st century might be that whatever states and governments do, there might be kind of strong Darwinian selection pressures in favor of some kind of neo-traditionalism that tries to manage and reduce the worst effects of technology. If I wanted to be optimistic socially, that's what I'd say. But it's an optimism that, again, is at sort of the end of a pessimistic story where lots and lots of people, families, societies, nations, like all of South Korea, right, just don't make it through this kind of bottleneck. So it's not a happy story in that sense.
Yeah. Aaron, do you think that feel free to respond to that, but another question for you is, do you think the act of riding the dragon that Ross talked about earlier, is there a way in which that Protestant kind of a renewal of sort of the spirit of Protestantism could kind of ride the dragon throughout the 21st century in your view?
Well, I don't see that in the cards happening. Okay. Maybe I'm not as pessimistic. I do think the CHIPS Act, we did put that together. I do think there's a recognition we have problems. So we could do it in terms of the properly regulating the technologies. I don't see the political coming there, but there's a lot I can't see. It's not all about what's in my. There's a much bigger world and a much bigger God that we know. I'm actually in some respects more worried about a sort of that we miss out on the future because of a kind of a neo-Luddite streak within maybe even the Trump administration, which has been very pro-crypto, pro-AI in some extents, but it's like, let's sign emergency orders to keep coal plants open. Let's try to cancel green energy projects. Let's cut the legs out from under electric vehicles, just as Chinese companies are massively starting to export Europe and master that technology. I wonder if we're going to essentially turn aside from technology in ways that, hand the future to China. And, I think our current administration is not as techno-positive as you might think from all of the sort of tech right discourse. But I think the regulatory aspects are worrisome. Let's be honest. It's not obvious how we, maybe we'll deal with the absolute worst. But what typically tends to happen is we do deal with sort of the absolute worst excesses. So the sexual revolution, divorce revolution came around, and my generation was the latchkey kids, right? Generation X, children of divorce. And we now say, it's positive, it's freedom.
What's a latchkey kid?
A latchkey kid is somebody has to come home by themselves because
They had the key.
they had the key. They're letting themselves
Parents are
in.
at work.
Yeah.
What's a
Parents
key?
are at work, the parents are divorced. And
It's a primitive form of task. Yeah.
And then we said, wait a minute, this idea that divorce is great for the parent, and the kids they'll be fine. So we had the more kind of like baby on board movement with the millennium, more high investment parenting in the kids. It was less the neglect that we had. And so I think we'll probably figure out how to avoid corrupting sports. There'll probably be some little things here and there, reforms. We'll probably put some limits on the technology with kids. But I don't see us the sexual revolution was not rolled back. The divorce revolution was not rolled back. I think we will try to ameliorate the absolute worst cases. But I think many of the negative effects are going to remain of those things realistically.
And concentrated at the bottom, and that's the point I would keep hammering home is that, upper middle class white professionals and intellectuals and stuff, we can think of all kinds of smart, clever boutique solutions for resisting the social pathologies of our age and insulating ourselves from them. But these people down here, the divorce revolution, you're right, for them, they overcame it by they just don't get married.
Mm-hmm. I think that, I do think there's a difference in the past. In the past, we saw our, the people of our country as our human capital as the greatest asset of our country. And so we wanted to leverage that. I think today, with the top 10% of the people control 50% of the purchasing power, and it's going up, increasingly, I think the subtext is people consider the mass population of America to essentially be superfluous to our future. And that is quite worrisome.
Seen as a burden.
Yeah.
And so I think our people are no longer seen as an asset, but as a liability. And so the idea of, we'll medicate them with the porn and the gambling, and that is seen, and we UBI fund it.
Exactly.
And that will be how we will essentially
We've achieved comedy.
And so I do think
in analysis
I do think
here.
that is one of the things that militates against it, because our people, if we actually need some workers, better to have an illegal immigrant or an H-1B who can't protest against exploitation or bad working conditions. That
But this is where religious ideas and arguments and obligations do become really important, because one of the features of the progressive era and the social gospel, which had its faults, I don't want to give it any kind of unqualified endorsement, but was this sense of upper class, mostly Christian obligation to recent immigrants, to people in slums, to people in difficult working conditions. And I do think if there is this kind of selection effect, and the upper middle class, my friend circle, right, figures out sort of effective models of parenting and marriage and church going and all of these things under these conditions, how you figure out how to transmit that to the rest of society is, certainly from a Christian perspective, it's the biggest challenge of that kind of world and that kind of dynamic.
I think that's an important point that's related. I mean, I think what you see among the right, part of the techno right and the left with this UBI, is fully automated luxury communism, right? This is like, okay, well, this concept of fully automated luxury communism.
I am familiar.
Yeah. So it's your friends, and so it's in a sense, in one of the pieces you had us read, there's just a picture of Wall-E, right? There's this idea that we can kind of use UBI and use technology and everybody can be fine. And I think, Aaron, your point is, but it is a very low view of human beings. Well, we'll just medicate you and we'll just kind of take care of you. But that's not how human beings want to live. I mean, like we can debate like, okay, do they want to gamble? Yeah, of course, like whatever. I'm saying, I think when you look in some of the poor communities, I've been doing a film on poverty in the United States, and I was in a place called Bonton, which is in South Dallas. It's very poor. Marriage is broken. 45% of the men in that community are going to prison. And they're doing this rejuvenation of the community, and they're working, they're building up health, they're creating like these communities and opportunity, because people don't want to live simply on UBI, and they don't want to live in disorder. And I think that part of it goes to the religious aspect. I think is multiple. I think first is the Christian vision of the human person is, in one sense, it's very pedantic and intellectual. But in another sense, I would say, and I have confirmation bias here, but I think it's essentially important. I mean, people are either treated, I mean, I think that the dominant views of the person right now are either plastic anthropology, you just can kind of invent yourself. And this is generally an upper class one, but as C.S. Lewis points out, man's power over nature is always some men's power over other men. So the plastic anthropology is an upper class one, but it's used on children and others. There's transhumanism, which you brought up. We're just going to kind of develop and evolve into a new kind of being by combining technology. And then there's the person as a cog, the person as a scourge on the environment. And I think the most, like maybe the encapsulating of all of them, and the most deadly is that the person's a commodity. The person has become an object of trade. And so part of what we need to do is and this goes to the churches, repropose the gospel of that the human person is made in the image of God with purpose and dignity and called to something higher. And I think this is where we can't give up and be pessimistic. We have to be filled with hope. And I know we'd probably share that, even we've never met, but I think we share that hope that human beings have something we have to affirm the goodness of being, the goodness of matter. And this is where there's an affirmation of the goodness of technology and the goodness of the human birth being in our social embodied, embedded nature. And we're not what the progressive left or the progressive right, the techno left, the techno right says we are. We're actually embodied, embedded human beings with a social nature called to human flourishing. And guess what? It's hard because we have the reality of sin and we have all these challenges against us. And here's where I would say there's both pessimism and optimism. I mean, and this is where I'm so glad, Frank, that you went against the Leviathan state, and now I've got you back on decentralized team, okay, against centralization. But I think this is where decentralized solutions are important, where you need Matthew doing his thing, and you need, like, my children go to a classical school here in Grand Rapids, Sacred Heart Academy. Is it perfect? No, of course not. Okay, but is it trying to do something? Yes, we're trying to reduce the amount of technology in the classroom. Public schools are trying to reduce the amount of technology in the classroom. I was in Gallup, New Mexico, at an amazing place. It's a charter school called Hojo Academy. 50% of the students are native population from the Navajo and the Zuni tribes around. They've grown from 100 students to 800 students in 7 years. Right? And they're doing classical education. They're getting computers out. They're reading books. And this is a place where they're like, these poor children, they can't do it. And they said, yes, we can. They can do it here. And now parents are sending them. People are seeing it. Models are growing. And so I think the optimism part is that if we think about care for the poor, which, and I think your points, Matthew, are super important. I mean, the poor are being hammered by divorce, hammered by drugs, hammered by gambling, hammered by porn, all of it. But part of the church's role, all right, and again, if you think of Catholic parishes, I think this is a challenge, especially for conservative Orthodox Catholics, of which I would consider myself one. Are we engaged enough in helping engage with the poor, or are we trying to be in a siege mentality against secular technocratic culture? And I think this is an important thing. I think about this a lot. Pure religion, St. James, in his epistle says pure religion is this: to care for the widow and the orphan in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. And we're supposed to do both, and we're supposed to keep ourselves unstained from the world. So we do need the siege against the evil forces that are trying to corrupt us. But I do think, and this is following on what you said, Ross and Matthew, the concern for the poor is so important. This is where the principle of subsidiarity, that those closest to the problem should deal with the problem. And I think, in a sense, this is why I'm not a progressive and not a technocrat, because there's no technical solution to the problems of poverty, sin, suffering, evil, or death. There is the gospel and the power of Jesus Christ, and then there is the power of Christians who are called to participate in that redemptive work. And I think that's a social aspect that's different from the social gospel, because it is, in a sense, private, decentralized, and voluntary. But it's also the core issue that people don't need necessarily another state program. They need relationships of love and modeling and help, just like we do.
Well, and
real quick to wrap this up,
Yeah.
I want to go to Frank and then Ross. Frank, talking from your perspective, again, as an entrepreneur, do you see this kind of a renewed moral, maybe even sacramental, or at least Christian ethical vision? How does that play out in your world? Can you see that coming back?
I don't see the witness and morality of the entrepreneurial class to the degree there is even such a thing as being that different from culture. I think entrepreneurs are a little more willing to break with convention, both from, Francis of Assisi was a bit of an entrepreneur. He said, I'm going to do this differently and reform the church. Okay, so it both toward God and away from God, they tend to be more adventurous, if you will. They have, but to pick up where Michael was going about we got to be unstained from the world and we got to help the poor. Bluntly, and I'm very involved in the church. Yes, I'm in the business world, but I've been more involved in philanthropy over the last 30 years than anything, and particularly within the churches. And bluntly, forget the great unwashed masses out there. Forget of all the Catholics, those who have left. I'm talking about the ones who are in the pews every Sunday. And we're not living a witness. It gets back to the Chesterton thing, what's wrong with the world? Me. I think part of the answer here is certainly to care for the poor, but what I've found, it's funny with venial sin, the little sins that aren't all that intentional, aren't all that serious, but it's like wax in your ears. And among the Christians I know, Catholic and Protestant, we've all got so much wax in our ears. The stuff we watch, the things we do, the 100%. Stuff we tolerate, the number of times we're on our phone, the number of times we're interrupting one another because we got to look at it. And so I don't want to sound simplistic. I don't think this is simplistic. But I think if we're going to have reform, we have to start looking at ourselves and our friends and say, do you mind putting the phone away? Do you mind doing this? If I do believe among the leadership class that others follow them. The key difference with the leadership class on sexuality is that they manage license more effectively.
Yep.
They're not, what I see is they're not living more morally. They manage their license more effectively.
Yep, exactly.
And so until we're giving good witness on that, on the use of technology, on all these issues, I don't think we have a voice to the world because they look at us and don't see us really living that differently. But I think if we do live differently, awakenings happen and that there's hope there. So I do have hope for that. But I think it starts with the spiritual awakening.
Amen. I'm with you. Ross,
I would just
bring this home, but also touch on C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, I would say that if you ask me, give us 75 years to wrestle with digital tech, AI, everything else, can we get a kind of localist, bottom-up response that retains our humanity and uses technology for good? I'm not going to say I'm certain about that, but I wouldn't bet against it. I think it's a reasonable hope to hold out. I think human beings have managed to deal with technological revolutions in the past. Christianity did not cease to exist, with the Industrial Revolution. In some ways, various forms of Christianity were supercharged by it, right? All of Christian history, all of modern Christian history is defined by missionary efforts that were themselves intimately connected to technological modernity. That's the optimistic case. The pessimistic case is that we are in a moment where the direction of key technologies is in the hands of a pretty small group of people, a few of whom are Christian, some very heretical kinds of Christians, most of them not, right? Who themselves have a lot of power over what happens at the local level and have the power to sort of themselves choose the direction of technology. So I would say, like, there's a thing that I like a lot about the tech right, which is that it came out of this period of sort of stagnation and where all the innovation in Silicon Valley was about building a better app and getting delivery faster. And the tech right said, hey, what about the material world? Why aren't we building flying cars and rockets and having energy and transformation breakthroughs and, you know, the world of materials rather than the world of the virtual? That's a tech right that I can get behind, that has a vision for innovation that I think is moral and good and embodied. But, you know, a big part of the tech right now, we don't even have to call it the tech right, just the tech world, but the tech right is as invested in this as any other part of Silicon Valley, right, is the idea that, you know, we're just going to accept the kind of obsolescence of the ordinary human being that you guys were talking about and build a machine god, right? Which is, you know, in the end, an extremely dangerous thing to be involved in. I think the big question for me hanging over that project is ultimately just how dangerous it is, right? There's a part of me as a Christian and a humanist and someone who believes in human exceptionalism that says, if you set out to build a machine god, you will just fail. And then there's a part of me that's read C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength and said, well, if you're trying to summon a discarnate intelligence into a machine that you're building, you know, there are some discarnate intelligences that would be very happy to show up. And a lot of the Christian navigation of the next 50 or 75 years might end up depending on just what the actual effects of that digital summoning are. So we'll find out.
Thank you for watching Project Cosmos, Conversations on the Future of Civilization, which is a production of ISI, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. If you're a student, professor, or lifelong learner who wants to get more involved with ISI, visit isi.org or follow us on social media to learn more about our educational programs that teach the foundations of Western and American civilization and what it means to be a great and good man or woman today. That's isi.org, or like and follow us on social media. Thank you.